Everyone. Yeah, so in the last lecture, we have discussed the XML namespaces, and the DTD for defining the rules on the XML documents. And various constants can be specified, how many elements or sub-element an element can contain, what are the attributes, how many times an element can occur in our XML document, 0 or more times, or 1 or more times, or 1 or 0 times, 0 or 1 times. Likewise, we can specify the different kinds of constraints on the XML elements. So there are two terms. Can anyone say what do we mean by well-formed XML? When can we say an XML document is well-formed? Okay. Every opening tag must have a corresponding closing tag. Proper nesting is required. So basically, it satisfies all the rules, syntax rules of XML. So when an XML document satisfy all the syntax rules, like every XML document must contain one and only one root element. We cannot have more than one root element. Thank you. So then the XML document is said to be well formed. And when can we say an XML document is valid? When can we say a given XML document is valid? So there are two terms. XML document can be well formed and valid. So if it is a root having root element, then it is called well formed. But when can we say it is valid? Okay, so when it satisfies the rules specified by the DTD, then it is called valid. It is called valid. So see the difference between well formed and valid. If it satisfies all the rules of DTD, then it is called valid. And if it satisfies all the rules of all the syntax rules, then it is called well formed. Is it clear the distinction between well formed and valid XML file? So it is quite possible that your XML document is well formed but not valid as per the DTD defined by the author, right? But before checking DTD, it must be well formed. Okay, if the XML document is not well formed, we cannot check for the validity. Okay, we cannot check for its validity, right? Okay, fine. So today we'll see that how to new standard for specifying the several constraints that we have learned in DTD. So let's begin with the standard called Xsd XML Schema Definition, which is the improved version of the DTD. So I will share my screen. So today we are going to learn this XML schema definition because which is a newer version or rather improved version of the DTD to define the constraints on the XML document. So basically it's an alternative to DTD and it is an XML base. So using that you can describe the structure of the XML file, and it stands for XML schema definition, sometimes called only schema. So when we say XML schema, we are normally referring to this XSD file. Okay. So nowadays people use XSD and DTD is not used, but for understanding purpose or for the beginners, DTD is easy to understand, and that's why we have covered it. But most of the time you will find the schema file instead of the DTD file because it is more advanced, more features available in the XSD. So let us directly look at the example schema file for some XML file. Once again, we'll refer to the XML document note, which contain 4 elements, 2 from heading and body. Now just go through this file and try to understand what's going on, but it is easy to understand because you can see that there are some keywords like element, then other the keywords like type, the name of the element, right? So just try to go through it, and whatever you understood you can type in the chat box, or if you have any question you can also type in. Okay, every tag should start with access. Why? Access is a prefix. Why it should start with access? The correct statement is not every. Okay, first you answer why the tag should start with access. Okay. Someone is giving answer that to differentiate from DTD or to indicate that it is XML schema. So we cannot say every tag should start with access. The tag which has the prefix access belongs to the namespace XML schema, right? So basically access is a prefix for particular namespace. That means suppose I have the element name or some tag name element, then that element belongs to the namespace XML schema. So you can see that in our document we have the we have the namespace defined as w3.org/2001/XML schema, right? Okay, first of all, is it XML file or not? Okay, it is an XML file, right? Because you can see that there is a first, it begins with the version. So schema files are itself XML files. DTD files are not XML files. Okay. So remember this, schema files are itself XML files. So the constants are also written in form of XML files. Secondly, what is the root element of this XML file? Because as we know, every XML document must contain a root element, schema, right? So schema is the root element. So whenever we look at an XML file and there is a schema root element, we know that it is an Xsd file, which specifies the constraints for some other XML document. Okay, so anything else you can infer from this file? Or if you have any question, you can also mention it in the chat box. Okay, we are defining type for the elements. Which element? But for which element? Okay, good question. That why access just before the data type string? So see that there are data types. There are predefined data types available in the XML schema that belongs to the namespace XML schema. So this string is not defined by the author. Okay. String is defined in the namespace XML schema, and that's why access is the prefix against that string. So see that's why interaction is required. Otherwise, I will go through the slide. You will not understand. It is already available on the net or in the book. So you will not get it unless you ask the question. So this is the time. Please ask question during the lecture, because in the online mode, it is necessary to ask the question. Basically, see that in we define a class, we use some class, but it belongs to some package. So we require to import that package. Okay, and there might be multiple package, and if multiple package may contain the same class name, then we must differentiate via the namespace, and that's why this is required. Okay, I hope that you know you get to know that the importance of the namespace. So the validator can easily understand that string belongs to the namespace XML schema. It is not defined by the author, or it is not defined by somewhere else in some other XML document, but it is defined in the XML schema. So basically it defines how the note element should look like. Okay, basically it defines the format of the XML document which contains a note element. So it defines that in our XML document there is a note element which contains 4 sub element, 2 from heading and body, with data types like string. See that there is a XML document is separate and our schema is different. Similarly, we have seen in the previous lecture, your XML document is separate and your DTD is separate file. So using DTD, we can specify the constraints. Okay, external DTD. So here this is a schema file which is separate from our XML document. So try to understand the difference between original XML document which contains data and understand the schema file in which we are writing rules for that document, XML document. See that everybody asks the question, otherwise it will become more confusing unless and until we go to the next slide. Before that, make sure that all your doubts gets cleared, and then it will become easier for you to understand the remaining set of slides. These are the fundamentals. Once you know this, then the rest of the thing will be easy to grasp. So I think there are so many things we can infer that note. Okay, let me answer a few questions. Yeah, so complex type means we are defining note element which is complex because it contains elements. Okay, if it doesn't contain element, then it would be simple. So there is also simple type. Okay, so we'll look at later on, but the question is good, why it is called complex. So see that please ask the question. You are the one that is trying to understand. Other students, I think they are not understanding or not getting from this slide. But if you are asking question, that means you are understanding the thing. Later on, we'll see the complex, the difference between simple type and complex type. An element contains sub-element, then it is called complex types. Yeah, and here what is the importance of sequence? Because these elements must occur in this order only, to, from, heading, body. It cannot occur in any other order. We cannot write from first, then to, then heading and body, or we cannot start with body, then to, from, heading. No any other orders allowed as part of our XML document, because we are strictly mentioning that note element must contain 4 sub element, and those elements must appear in this sequence only. I hope that this slide is clear. All the things, and the data type is also specified via the attribute type. The name of the element are specified by the name. So see that some of the tag are not without having a prefix, and some of them are having with the prefix. That means with the prefix they belong to the namespace schema, right? So schema is nothing but the building block of the XML document, in which we can define what kind of element our document may contain, what type of attributes it may contain, what type of child elements that it may contain, the order of the child elements, the number of the child elements, whether an element can be empty or it can even include the text inside the element, even the data type of the elements or attributes, or the default or fixed value of the elements can be specified via the XML schema. So that is the purpose of using the XML schema. I hope that all these points are clear, which are just highlighted via the boldface text, so that you can focus on the main features of the schema files. What are the features of the XML schema? Why should we use it? Because these are the functionality provided by this XML schema. So XML schema is the successor of the DTD, and that's why it contains more features than the DTD. Even it is extensible to future editions, so that using it you can extend it easily. It is richer and more powerful than DTD, and it is itself written in XML. So if you make mistake in writing the schema, the XML parser can see that your schema file itself is incorrect. Now it has support for the data types and namespaces. So in DTD you do not have the, you had only two allowed data types, C data and PC data, while in Xsd there are number of data types. All the majority data types are supported by the schema. So using schema, you can easily describe the content of the XML document. You can validate the correctness of the data. Even you can work with the data which has been retrieved from the database. You can define the different kind of restrictions on the data. You can define the patterns for the data, or even you can convert the data between different data types. So these are the more features of the XML schema data types. And again, if we will look at the example, then it will become more clear how the restriction occur, how can we specify the patterns, how we can convert the data between two different data types, and so forth. So basically, it is written in using the XML syntax. So you can use any XML editor to edit or write your schema files, and the parser can validate, check that it is a valid, well-formed XML document or not. And using it, you can also manipulate the XML DOM, and you can transform using XSLT. So these are few more standards for converting the data types, your data into other data types. We'll see that later on. Okay. Another benefit of XML schema is it secures the data communication. We have seen the example of date that in different countries the date format is different. So if you are exchanging the data between two websites which belong to two different countries, which contains the date as part of the data, there is a possibility of error or mismatch, because the date format is different for different countries. But if all of the people use the schema file, then the date format is same, because it is year, month, and date. Okay, so XML schema supports the date data type. Using date data type, you can define the dates, and there is a common convention for everybody. So whenever there is a standardization, you get the benefit. And if you see that if there is no standardization, the customer are the loser, because now you cannot do the conversion easily. You do not get the benefit of translation, easy translation. Now XML schemas are extensible. So in our programming, we are using classes, and we can reuse it using inheritance. Okay. Similarly, here also there are many things you can reuse your data types. There is a provision of creating custom data types. Okay. And you can refer these data types across multiple schema documents. So these are the benefits of XML schema. So why we are calling it as extensible? Because it supports reusability. So existing types you can create your own data types or custom types, and you can reuse it in multiple schema files. This is the different data types available in the schema. So right from date, then Boolean data type, string, decimal, integer, long, short, int, okay, double, float, all these data types are there. And it is an hierarchy of inheritance of the data types available in the schema. You can directly use it because in many of the languages you will find a lot of different types of data: short integer, long integer, okay, byte data type. All these are there already, so that you can easily match the data type of particular programming languages with one of the available in the Xsd file. Okay, so you can see, I hope that it is readable on your screen. You can see the hierarchy of many data types, and many of the data types we are using it. And other than that also there are more data types. Anyway, yeah. So this is the XML file for which we have seen the example schema file, that an element node contains four sub-element in the sequence, two from heading and body. Okay, and in the previous lecture we have seen the DTD for that, and now you can compare it with the schema. So now suppose I want to refer to the, instead of referring to the DTD, if I want to make sure that it is referring to the schema file, so see the syntax part. What, so suppose this is the original XML document. Suppose I want to make sure that the content of this XML document should follow the rules defined in the external XSD file. So there is no internal XSD, always it is an external XSD. For DTD, you have two options: internal DTD or external DTD file. But for XSD, there is only one option: external XSD. So if you want to make sure that all the content of this XML file must follow the rules defined in the external XSD file or external schema file, then you have to specify it by using this. Let's go to the example. So now you see that a node element contains defines few things. First, namespace is w3school.com. What does it mean? After node, there is a statement XML NS. What does it mean? Namespace. Okay. And more precisely, good. So we are defining namespace. Yeah, Canil is right. It is default namespace. See that there is no prefix defined, and whenever if if you are defining namespace without prefix, then we are defining the default namespace. So here w3school.com is the default namespace. That means all the tag which are defined without the prefix belongs to this namespace. I hope that this is clear. The first statement after note. Everybody? Okay, fine. So let us look at the second statement. Now it defines the namespace with the prefix XSI. So now there are two namespaces. One is default, another is with the prefix XSI. So it refers to the global schema instance. It refers to the global schema instance defined by the w3.org. Okay. And third statement is it defines that there is an attribute called schema location, which is defined in the namespace XML schema instance, and it specifies pair like the namespace and the file in which we are defining our rules. They are separated by white space. So we are defining the schema for the namespace w3school.com, and all the rules are stored into the file note.xsd. So see that there are two files we need to create: note.xml, and the content of that is in front of you. And second file we already seen, note.xsd, which will specify the rules for the content appearing in this XML file. Is this clear? You can see that all the tag to, from, heading, body are without prefix. That means they belong to which namespace? Default namespace, right? And default is w3schools.com, correct? And this rules are defined in the file note.xsd. So we have to create two files. First one is this one, note.xml. Another is note.xsd, which we already seen previously. Okay, and now this is the xsd file. Now we are adding few more attributes. The root element is schema, because now this is the schema file. It is itself an XML file. Then you have the how many namespaces are defined in this file? Okay, let's go to the schema location. That schema location means what is the location of the your schema file, and secondly, it operates on which namespace. Okay, so basically this file is for the XML document with the namespace w3schools.com. Okay, so yeah, somebody has already answered. Hertz has answered that there are two namespaces. Is there any default namespace defined in this file? What is the default namespace? Yeah, w3school.com is the default namespace. So there are two namespaces. One is having with the prefix access, which is for your schema file. Second is the namespace which is used by the node.xml. Now, this two is clear. Now we'll talk about target namespace. So as the name suggests, that means whenever we are, this schema is defined for the XML document having the namespace w3school.com. So that's why it is called as target namespace. Is it clear? Target namespace. The name itself suggests that the schema or the rules defined in these documents are meant for the XML document for which the namespace is w3school.com, which is for our node.xml. Here you can see that for this document, the namespace is w3schools.com. Is it clear? Target namespace. I think it is easy. Okay, good question. Can anyone answer how to decide which one is default namespace? Keval is asking how to identify the default namespace. Good question. Can anyone answer? Correct. Without prefix. If we are defining namespace without prefix, then it is default namespace. Okay. So now the fourth part, element from default equal to qualified. So we see that sometime we are having elements from different namespaces. And when we are defining the element which belongs to different namespaces, we must specify the prefix in front of the name. Okay. So name and prefix are separated by colon character. So here we are saying that are there any elements without any prefix? Then that question can be answered by this attribute called element from default. Qualified means all the elements must be qualified. They must belong to some namespace. Okay, so every element in your document must belong to some namespace. It should not be possible that they do not belong to any namespace. So every element must be qualified. Okay. Okay, so there is a question, what is meant by target namespace? So this file is defined for the XML file with the namespace w3schools.com, that is the target. Okay, and that's why we call it as a target namespace. See that whenever we are writing schema file, we are writing for some XML document, isn't it? It is meant for some XML document. So, and that XML document might have some namespace. That namespace is called target namespace. So see that some validation will not occur, because if we do not specify this target namespace, it won't be able to identify. So see that there are two things here. It is target namespace. So it won't be able to, for the validator, it will become difficult that for which XML file these are applicable. So when the validator, if you want to validate the XML file against your schema file, you need to provide both the files, XML document as well as the schema file, Xsd file. So in that case, from this attribute, it will identify that this schema is operating on the given XML document. And that's why this target namespace is required. Now we are discussing about element form default. Is it clear? Qualified means by default it is unqualified. Unqualified means we can have element without any prefix in our document, or the element which do not belong to any namespace. So this is allowed. That means it is unqualified. But when we say it is qualified, means every element must have belongs to some namespace. Okay, so the rest we have already discussed. So I hope that this example is clear. So now you can see the cross reference between XML file and schema file. In schema file, we are referring to XML. In XML, we are referring to the schema file. So cross reference is required. You can see that in XML, we are referring to the schema file via the schema location. And in our schema file, we are referring to the XML via the target namespace. And here you can see that the string data type has the prefix access because it belongs to the namespace schema. But there is a to, from, heading and body. They are not having prefix. Why? In this schema file, there are these are the element name, to, from, heading, body. There is no prefix. Why? So here is the statement that why I have done here, why I have written this line. Can anyone tell me? Can anyone answer? Because here the STR is the type character. See that element has the prefix access, sequence has the prefix access, complex type has the prefix access, string has prefix access. But to, from, heading and body has no prefix. The correct answer is they belong to default namespace. Yeah, they belong to default namespace, and that is your w3schools.com. So that's why there is your file may be mixture of the element name without prefix, or some of the element are with prefix. Okay, so we have discussed this. We have also discussed qualified, and these are the example of qualified and unqualified. But we know what do we mean by qualified, that it belongs to some namespace. Okay, fine. Now we'll talk about the types of elements which may be present in our XML document. So one type of element is called simple. If an element contains only text. So try to understand when we call an element simple. So there are two cases. Or rather, if it contains only text, then it is called simple. If it contains either attribute or sub element, then it is called complex. Is it clear? Simple element means an element which contains only text. It cannot contain sub element or even attribute. So the simple element cannot contain attribute, cannot contain sub element, and it can contain only the text. Okay, so we define it by the this element in schema. We specify element, name of the element, type of the element. Okay, so these are the examples. Last name, age, date born. So you can see that these are the simple element in XML document, and there is a corresponding schema definitions also. So take your time, see the match, try to match the XML against the schema definitions. So last name is an element, age is an element, date born is an element in my XML document with the data types string, integer, and date respectively. So we are going bit by bit. We are not going for the complex example. We are going bit by bit. We are just going for simple example and moving towards the more complex one. So starting with the simple, it is always easier. We go step by step. We don't directly jump to the complex example. It will become confusing if we start with the complex example. But as we move on, the complexity will be increased. Okay, so try to focus right now, go step by step, but try to understand, because these terms will be reused again and again, and at that time when I say simple type, you need to remember what I have covered. Okay, so when I say simple type, or if I reuse it again in the upcoming slide or in upcoming lectures, that remember what do we mean by simple type. Any doubt in this slide? Okay, so I have given enough time, and I hope the example is simple enough. And variety of data types are used: string, integer, date, and three different elements, and how the definition looks in our schema file. Okay. Now you can easily specify the default value or fixed value via these two attributes, default and fixed, which are shown in red color. So now these are some easier thing. I will not elaborate. I think it doesn't require much explanation. So, but still, if you find any questions, let me know via the chat box. Default value, use the default attribute. Fixed value can be specified via the fixed attribute in the schema file. So basically, we are learning how to specify rules in our schema file. We can define the name of the element, the data type via the type attribute, and we can specify the whether it should contain a default value or fixed value. So if my element doesn't contain any value, the validator will assume the default value. So if I have an empty element, though I have defined the empty element, it will assume the default value red. So suppose I'm defining an element color something like this. Or something like this. Then even though I'm specifying color, which is an empty element, then the validator will assume the value to be red because default value is red. Yes, I think this you can change the order of type and fix or default. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. How to define the attributes? The next question is an element may also contain attribute. So that can be defined via the keyword attribute, the name of the attribute and the type of the attribute. So let's see the example. Suppose I have an element called last name with the attribute language. So a person can have a last name and that person talks some language, say English, so that is the en. Then this element contains an attribute. So to define the attribute for this element, we can define it in our Xsd file via this attribute. The name is language, attribute name, and the data type is string. So is it clear how to define the attribute? Attribute name, attribute keyword, attribute name, and type. This is string. Access string means it belongs to the schema. Similarly, you can define the default values or fixed values of the attributes. So this is also, I think, simple. You can use the same keyword default and fixed for respective constraint. So again, I will quickly go through the next slide. Yeah. See that attributes are optional by default, but if you want to make it required, you can use the use keyword, use equal to required, then attribute is mandatory. So by default, attributes are assumed to be optional unless you specify, unless you make it mandatory by the keyword use equal to required. So see, some of the things are default and you can override the defaults via the different keywords. Okay, now you can put restrictions on the content of the element or attribute. So we'll see the examples. Okay. Suppose I have an element car, which, so suppose if I define the element car with the element string, then it can contain any string. But suppose I want to make sure that the car value may be one of the three value, okay, like Audi, Golf or BMW, then I can put restrictions. Okay, so in schema, XML schema, you can specify the restriction, and there is also an enumeration through which you can define the enumeration of the different values. Suppose I have a car element, so which is a simple type because it can contain only string values. There is no attribute. Car cannot have any attribute. Car cannot contain sub element. So, and it must contain only three possible values. Then we can use the restriction. So basically these values are string, and that's why the base data type is string, and we are restricting the string to be of only 3 values. Okay, so let me give you that example. Write the example in the chat box. You can see that in an example, car which is having value BMW. So we already learned that this is a simple element. So I could have written string also, but if I define the element to be of type string, then the user can write any string, invalid string also, XYZ. It would be accepted by the XML validator. So to make sure that the value must be from these 3 values only, we can use this restriction. So earlier someone asked what is complex types. So now you can see the difference between complex type and simple type. Is it clear? Someone has asked what is complex type. So if it is not simple, it is complex. So you can see the car example, which does not contain attribute. That's why it is simple, as well as it doesn't contain any sub element. That's why it is simple. And all other elements are complex. So an element can be either simple or complex. And further, if you want to put restriction that it can contain only few values, because string data type will allow any combination of characters. But if I want to restrict to a set of values only, then you can use the restrictions. Okay, and the base data type is string, and now out of that we are using the enumeration, that only out of these three, only these 3 values are allowed as the car text. Okay, fine. I think we'll stop at this point and we'll continue with this few more features of XSD in the next lecture. Okay, thank you, everyone.